Hello, we are transmitting live from San Diego, California, in the studios of KPBS on the campus of San Diego State University. Greetings to our distinguished participants in Canada, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, and the United States of America. And to our participants in Santo Domingo, in the Dominican Republic, Mar del Plata, and Buenos Aires, in Argentina, and Montevideo, Uruguay, are with us for the first time. And as our various sites throughout the United States and Canada, which are we are reaching through the public broadcasting system's PBS Adult Learning Satellite Service located in Alexandria, Virginia. This is truly the first video conference of the International Training Center to reach all of the Americas. We should all feel very proud of this historic accomplishment. We would like to thank Telecomunicaciones de México, PanamSat, BrasilSat, Nael, ANEC E2 for their satellite linkage services, which allow us to reach all of you directly through the wonders of telecommunication. This is the first ever instructional program linking 6 satellite systems internationally. Congratulations. And remember also, we are reaching you in 3 languages simultaneously: English, Spanish, and Portuguese. The latter through the able work of our associate in Brazil, KTV. We also acknowledge the initiative of and program support provided by the U.S.-Mexico Conflict Resolution Center at New Mexico State University, located in Las Cruces, and the invaluable leadership of its director, Nancy Oretskin. Today's program, entitled International Negotiation and Conflict, New Strategies and Techniques, is the first of a 3-part mini-series entitled International Conflict Management and Dispute Resolution. My name is Richard Page. I will be your moderator. The 3 programs, the titles of which you can find in your participant manual, constitute an integrated series of presentations covering the application of alternative dispute resolution techniques to international situations. This program is comprised of 2 presentation modules and 2 question and answer sessions. We look forward to your live participation. As the head of the San Diego law firm Page, Poland, Bush & Boatwright's litigation and international departments, which practice in the areas of business and international law, the subjects being presented today and in the remainder of this mini-series are of an intense and immediate interest to me, my firm, and to our clients. Every day we deal with businesses and commercial disputes and find ourselves increasingly involved in negotiation and conciliation and mediation, including arbitration, in addition to our traditional litigation activities. Because of our proximity to Mexico, many of these disputes involve businesses operated on both sides of the border. With the creation of NAFTA and the increase of trade throughout the Americas, the need for negotiation and the techniques of alternative dispute resolution will only increase. In the United States, the term alternative dispute resolution is referred to by the acronym or by the initials ADR. This concept arose from businessmen and businesswomen looking for ways to control the soaring costs and the unpredictability of litigation in the United States. These techniques were referred to as alternative because they focused on resolution outside the courts and the formal judicial system. They were an alternative to going to court. The ADR movement is not intended to work against the courts. It is designed to work with the courts. Many of the judges sitting on the federal and state benches throughout the United States consider ADR to be the most effective way to reduce the backlog of cases and to supplement the limited resources which are available to the judiciary. Throughout Latin America, national judicial systems are experimenting with and implementing systems of arbitration, mediation, and conciliation for domestic disputes. The focus of this unique mini-series is the application of these ADR techniques in the international context and the exploration of ways to coordinate the independent efforts being taken throughout the Americas. As the global economy becomes a reality and improved communications bring us into increasing contact with cultures different than our own, there exists one certainty. From this increased contact will arise disputes, and the mechanism for resolution of these disputes will measure the progress we make toward dealing with our neighbors. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today distinguished guests and expert speakers, Mary Teagarden from the School of Business Administration and James Holbein from the Department of Commerce, U.S. NAFTA Secretariat in Washington, D.C., and a sincere welcome to each of you. Our first presentation module will be given by Dr. Mary Teagarden. Dr. Teagarden is a distinguished professor of business administration at San Diego State University and has consulted on business and educational issues in various Pacific Rim nations. Dr. Teagarden is the co-author of the book, A Resource Guide for International Business School Curriculum, Organizational Behavior and Human Resource Management, and author of International Management and Managing Global Diversity, Setting New Business Frontiers, Joint Ventures in the People's Republic of China, and of the book International Management. Before we begin, I would like to ask the following question of Dr. Teagarden. Do you believe that the process of intense globalization of our economies is truly accelerating the adoption of new strategies and techniques for dispute resolution in government, business, and in society generally, or will the traditional methods be sufficient?
Dick, I don't think that the traditional methods will be sufficient, because what we're seeing is we're going to situations where there's a much higher reliance on the need for collaboration between parties, and that introduces conflict into these relationships. Alternative dispute resolution is a very good technique for lowering that level of conflict and enhancing the relationships between the parties.
Our second presentation module will be given by James Holbein of the Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C. Mr. Holbein is the U.S. Secretary of the North American Free Trade Agreement Secretariat. This agreement is commonly referred to as NAFTA, or as the Tratado de Libre Comercio, or TLC. He played a similar role for the United States-Canada Free Trade Agreement Binational Secretariat, which agreement is known as the CFTA. He is responsible for managing the unique dispute settlement mechanisms created by NAFTA and the CFTA. He is the author of more than 20 papers on international law and dispute settlement, and the co-editor of the legal series North American Free Trade Agreements and the Practitioner's Desk Book, NAFTA. Mr. Holbein, before we begin, I would like to ask you the following question. How can alternative dispute resolution mechanisms be useful for conflicts involving governments, or are they only applicable to private business conflicts?
In any large trade agreement, you need a mechanism for governments to resolve conflicts or disputes that will inevitably arise about the interpretation of such agreements. And as I will describe in my presentation, Chapter 20 of NAFTA provides such a mechanism. Also under NAFTA, we've a separate system for certain private disputes under Chapter 19. In addition, in the United States, we have a Federal Alternative Dispute Resolution Act, which provides for a government arbitration or arbitration through the government of private claims in contracting and other circumstances. And in fact, that process is now being extended through a recent action that I think you could fill us in on, Dick.
Yes, we understand that President Clinton, within the last several months, has just signed an executive order allowing the Department of Justice and the United States attorneys throughout the United States to enter into binding arbitration and to use other areas of ADR involving disputes in which the United States government is a party. This is a very new program. It's a very new expansion. It's something that we hope we will be able to explain more to you in the coming mini-series and the other two programs that we will present in the future. This is a very exciting event, and it has a lot of consequences, especially for governments throughout the Americas. Let us begin now with Module 1, where Dr. Teagarden will explain some creative solutions for conflict resolution.
Reflecting on the past decade, we've seen the emergence of three notable trends in the global marketplace: restructuring, or changing the way we do business; relocation, or changing where we do business; and re-engineering, or changing relationships and responsibilities within our organizations. These new global realities are not only changing the way we think about doing business, they're forcing us to use creative approaches, both strategies and techniques, to resolve the inevitable conflict encountered in this uncharted business terrain. These trends have brought considerable benefits. Our organizations and economies are more efficient and effective, and as a result of these changes, our customers, those outside and inside the organization, are better served because we're closer to them, and thus able to better understand and respond to and even anticipate their needs. On the other hand, these trends have also cost us something. They've introduced sources of conflict into our business relationships. We'll explore some of the conflict introduced by these trends in the following examples. The change in the use of strategic alliances in the last 20 years is striking. In 1975, less than 30% of all U.S. foreign affiliates were alliances. There was a distinct preference for wholly owned subsidiaries. The same proportion held true for our European and Japanese foreign affiliates. The number of foreign investments was also small, less than 5,000 for U.S. investors, who at the time had more foreign investments than their European or Japanese competitors. By 1995, almost three-quarters of U.S. foreign investment is in the form of strategic alliances. And again, the same proportions hold true for our European and Japanese investors. Firms use these alliances, joint ventures, research consortia, long-term licensing agreements, and the like, when they need local business know-how and access to established channels of distribution. In other words, firms use alliances when their partners have something they need. In addition to the shift from wholly owned subsidiaries to alliances, the number of investments has grown dramatically to approximately 18,000 for U.S. investors. While I don't have specific numbers for our European and Japanese competitors, I know that the trend towards similar numbers of investments is the reality. While historically investment occurred most frequently between industrialized country trading partners, it now also includes significant investment between industrializing country partners. The use of alliances requires partners to blend their corporate cultures and identities. It also requires them to share skills and resources. In other words, to engage in collaborative rather than competitive behavior. A very difficult undertaking for many firms. As a result, it should be no surprise that the failure rate in these alliances is high. This is especially true when there's a big size difference between partners or significant technological asymmetry in the relationship. And if the alliance is between a first world and third world partner, the failure rate is highest of all, approaching 70%. The need for collaboration in these relationships introduces conflict that most firms are not equipped to manage. When this collaboration occurs across cultural boundaries, conflict potential increases. When it occurs across economic development boundaries, there's even more potential for conflict. The second major trend is relocation. Relocation perhaps introduces more potential for conflict than the others. Firms are changing where they do business by locating manufacturing facilities in countries that afford quality and cost advantages. An example is the proliferation of the use of maquiladoras in Mexico by U.S. investors. They're also relocating to be closer to their customers, especially firms in the service sector. Traditionally, there has been a heavy emphasis on trade and investment between industrialized countries. There is an even heavier emphasis on trade within industrialized regions, the U.S. or North America, Japan, and the European Union, which are called the triad. Much of the trade attention has traditionally focused on trade within the triad. In fact, more trade takes place within regions, such as the European Union or North America, than between triad countries. Of the 22 largest industrialized economies in the world, 21 are part of a trading bloc, such as the European Union, EFTA, NAFTA, Mercosur, or ASEAN. Japan is the only industrialized country not part of a trading bloc. These multilateral agreements are designed to facilitate the reality of within-region trade. In other words, to reduce some of the friction that national sovereignty presents to the free flow of goods and services. The relocation trend, however, is toward more north-south trade. Business experts forecast that by the year 2020, the U.S. will be doing more trade with Latin America than with the European Union and Japan combined. Europe will do more trade with the former Eastern Bloc countries and with Africa than with the U.S. or Japan. Japan will do more trade with its Asian Pacific neighbors than with either the U.S. or the European Union. This forecasted shift in where we do business further complicates the challenges faced by companies that do business internationally. Firms will have to successfully span both the national culture gap and the economic development gap if they're to be successful in the emerging global marketplace. International business success now requires and will continue to require both strong cross-cultural communication competence so that we communicate effectively with our foreign partners regardless of national culture or level of economic development, and some blending of national cultures, especially blending our laws and practices to enhance intra-regional trade. Relocation introduces conflict by increasing the opportunity for cross-cultural misinterpretation, one of the biggest threats to international business effectiveness. The third trend, re-engineering, basically changes responsibilities and relationships in the organization. It changes who does what. Traditionally, our organizations have been organized around functions: accounting, engineering, finance, production, marketing, and even human resource management. These functions have been arranged hierarchically. Everyone has a boss who really made the decisions. Global competition requires speed, flexibility, and customer responsiveness that cannot be realized in these traditional functional hierarchical organizations. Companies find that they must be more organic, in other words, learning organizations, to survive in the global marketplace. As a result, workers at lower and lower levels in the organization are empowered to make important decisions for the organization. And the use of multifunctional teams for problem solving and strategy creation and implementation have become the norm. For successful international competitors, these teams are multifunctional and also multicultural, which throws national culture and professional culture into conflict. Re-engineering in the global context requires the blending of professional cultures and sometimes national cultures. This blending introduces additional conflict because of the different professional maps that organization members bring to the team. The professional culture of engineers or accountants is very different from the professional culture of marketers or human resource managers. From these three examples, we can see that restructuring requires the blending or hybridization of corporate cultures. Relocating requires the blending, or at a minimum, the understanding of national cultures. And re-engineering requires the blending of professional cultures and sometimes national cultures. We'll now look at some of the wisdom that comes from the study of cross-cultural effectiveness as we continue our exploration of finding creative solutions for conflict resolution. Essentially, different backgrounds, history, language, religion, and environment lead to different assumptions about what should or ought to be. These different assumptions lead to different interpretation of events, which in turn result in individual perceptions and differences in institutions, social, legal, political, and economic systems. An example here might be the difference in legal traditions. In most of the U.S., English common law is the tradition. From this perspective, a person is innocent until proven guilty. In Mexico and much of Latin America, Roman law is the tradition. From this perspective, a person is guilty until proven innocent. These legal traditions are a result of the U.S. having been colonized by England and Mexico and much of Latin America having been colonized by Spain. Institutional harmonization is one potential source of creative conflict resolution. NAFTA is an example of the harmonization of legal institutions. Cultural misinterpretation or differences in individual perceptions are frequently at the heart of conflict, bad feelings, and unintended consequences between individuals who transact business internationally. It's critical to appreciate that agreements may be between organizations, such as an agreement to establish a joint venture, or between countries, such as NAFTA, but they are transacted between people, individuals who are representatives and vehicles through whom agreements and trade happen. An example of the misinterpretation that can lead to unintended consequences can be seen in considering a dialogue between a Japanese and Westerner. When a Japanese says yes, hi, as he will frequently do, in the West we interpret this as agreement. However, the appropriate interpretation is I hear you or I'm following what you're saying, not I agree. A Westerner may leave the dialogue believing he has an agreement, while the Japanese leaves the same dialogue believing he has had a good conversation. The management challenge is to mold this conflict into a constructive form. For example, to surface important issues, to facilitate learning and growth, or to develop trust and openness. This begins by understanding issues related to the specific conflict. The management of conflict must include attention to 5 issues. 1, the source of the conflict or where it is coming from. Is it coming from different values, different or conflicting goals and objectives, different methodologies, and so forth? 2 is the content of the conflict. For example, what is the history of the conflict? How do cultural and organizational factors affect the conflict? What investment is the organization willing to make to resolve the conflict, and so forth? 3, the relative power of the conflicting parties. Basically, what is the balance of power in the conflict? 4 is the reaction of the parties to the conflict. In other words, how aware are the conflicting parties of the sources and contextual issues? And 5, the strategic importance of the conflict, and especially its resolution to the parties. The ability to understand or manage these 5 issues rests greatly on an understanding of the communications process and obstacles to effective communication inherent in cross-cultural interactions. Theorists tell us that the communication process is initiated when one communicator sends an intended message and the receiver receives that message, but distorts it based on their perceptions. When the receiver responds, the same differences in sent versus received response occur. Unfortunately, this framework is too simple to capture the complexity of cross-cultural communication across national, organizational, and professional cultures. Let's look at a framework that is closer to reality. As we can see from this diagram, our cultural frames are filters that distort communication. So are a variety of other issues. Ethnocentrism, false attributions. Remember our Japanese Westerner example mentioned earlier? Stereotypes, etiquette, nonverbal behaviors. Researchers tell us that more than 90% of our communication is nonverbal. Time, place, topic. There are some topics that simply cannot be discussed in different cultures. Status, power, style, and language. Let's look at how these issues come into play in a cross-cultural international business encounter.
In Mexico, the personal relationship comes first, and then business will go smoothly.
¡Hey, mi hermano! ¿Qué tal, hombre? ¿Cómo estás?
Mucho gusto. ¿Qué te trae?
Encantado de saludarte, señor. Es un placer. Cuánto gusto. ¿Y los niños cómo están?
Muy bien, gracias. En el colegio.
Buen provecho. Mr. Thompson. Sorry, I'm a little late.
Yeah, for a while I thought maybe I had the wrong cafe.
You haven't ordered anything yet.
No.
Oh, let me get you some beautiful brandy. Armando, por favor, 2 copas de brandy añejo Presidente. Por favor, ¿ah? Gracias. Sit down, please. Is your family traveling with you?
No, not this time, I'm afraid.
That's too bad. Imagine traveling to a foreign country without loved ones can be a lonely experience. Don't you agree?
Well, I travel a lot. You know, I sometimes even forget what my wife looks like. I've been spending so much time promoting this new line of equipment that we've got, though. I'd like to talk to you about that new system.
Tell me, have you seen any of the local sites yet?
No?
Oh, the architecture here is so beautiful, magnificent. I like to think that it reflects our Spanish heritage, but also our Mexican identity, too.
Must be beautiful.
Oh, for instance, our national cathedral was built in the 16th century during the colonial time. I will love to take you there a little later this afternoon if you like.
Thanks, but I think I better pass. You see, this is really a business trip for me, and I wanted to talk to you about the advantages of that new system.
Mr. Thompson, we have a saying that is, uno trabaja para vivir. Uno no vive para trabajar. What it means is one works to live. One does not live to work. One could never let business interfere with your enjoyment. Ours is a truly magnificent city, rich with history, art.
It is a wonderful city.
Beautiful.
And I really look forward to doing business here. Now, this is our new catalog. I think you'll be impressed by our improved equipment. It is the most advanced in the world and at a very reasonable price.
Here we have the brandy I was talking to you about. See? This is the most beautiful brandy in the world. Salud. A su salud. That means to your health, Mr. Thompson. Salud. Salud.
Now, let me show you something. This is our new model 720. I'd like to... I've got some charts. I'm trying to show you just where we... Now, we're trying to compare the kind of work you did last year with... Well, I've got some figures for you.
The American was getting a lot of signals from Mr. Herrera about Mr. Herrera's expectations. Mr. Herrera was pointing out that there was a wonderful cathedral that he wanted you to see. It was something he was proud of. It was representative of his culture. And by paying attention to that and getting excited about it with him, chances are that great strides could be made toward the final negotiation much faster than pushing the contract at him.
This man, Thompson, he wasn't there talking to me. He was only talking to himself. He was talking to his catalog, the sales and catalogs. That's all. No, I will never think for a moment to sign that contract. No way, Mr. Thompson. That's not the way to do business in Mexico or in Latin America. Salud.
The cross-cultural communication process is very complex. Let's look at one small example that illustrates the complexity. It illustrates the pattern of interruption used by negotiators from 3 different cultures. In the U.S., the pattern is alternating. I speak, then you speak. We do not interrupt each other, and we do not have long delays or pauses in our conversation. In Japan, the pattern includes silent periods. I speak, then you think about what I said, then you respond. It would be rude to respond immediately. In Brazil and many Latin American countries, I speak and you interrupt before I've finished. This is not to signal disrespect, but rather the opposite. We are so much on the same wavelength that we can speak at once. Think about the frustration, not to mention the conflict, that a Brazilian and Japanese would experience when negotiating or even discussing a fishing trip. Despite obstacles such as this, negotiation is frequently the best solution for smoothing obstacles between trading partners. If the value of the exchange is high, as is often the case in business transactions, particularly alliances, if maintenance of the relationship is important, if commitment to the partner is important, if time is sufficient, if trust is high, and if there is little power difference between partners where they really see each other as equals, then negotiation is the best strategy for the partners to use. Other alternatives might include bargaining, which involves splitting the difference, or a take-it-or-leave-it approach. However, if the intent of the interaction is to deal with and manage the conflict, then there are other alternatives. This conflict resolution framework identifies an array of alternatives for dealing with conflict. Avoiding means pretending that the conflict does not exist. Fighting means seeking a win-lose resolution to the conflict. Bargaining means splitting the difference. Smoothing means agreeing to disagree. Problem solving means facing the issues together and jointly seeking resolution. Problem solving offers the most potential for creative conflict resolution. Problem solving can only be successful in the context where there is a high concern for oneself or organization and a high concern for the partner or the partner's organization. This is the very context in which many global competitors find themselves, especially those who are using alliances and learning organizations to compete. The negotiators who hammered out NAFTA, for example, engaged in joint problem solving. Culturally synergistic relationships create new forms of management and organization that transcend individual cultures of the partners. Building cultural synergy is a particular approach to joint problem solving that holds particular promise for enhancing the outcome of international negotiation and resolving international conflict. In the process of creating cultural synergy, basically the parties describe the situation from their distinct cultural perspectives. U.S. versus Mexican, Seagrams versus Tropicana Peninsular, engineering versus human resource management. An example that focuses on a Canadian-Egyptian interaction might illustrate better. An Egyptian executive, after entertaining his Canadian guests, offered joint partnership in a business venture. The Canadian, delighted with the offer, suggested that they meet the next morning with their respective lawyers to fill in the details. The Egyptians never arrived. Was the problem that Egyptians lacked punctuality? That the Egyptian was expecting a counter-offer? Or that lawyers are not available in Cairo? None of these explanations were true, although the Canadian executives suggested each of them. The second step in building cultural synergy is to try to identify or explain the cultural assumptions that underlie the differences. At issue in the preceding example was the perceived meaning of inviting lawyers. The Canadians saw the lawyer's presence as facilitating a successful negotiation. The Egyptian interpreted it as signaling a Canadian's mistrust of his verbal commitment. How can you possibly do business with a partner you don't trust? In the third step, the partners assess cultural overlaps, that is, similarities and differences. Here they not only identify differences, but also common ground, which can form the basis for creative conflict resolution. The fourth step is the creation of culturally synergistic alternatives, new alternatives based on, but not limited to, the cultures involved. Examples here might include the use of alternative dispute resolution techniques, such as arbitration or mediation as alternatives to litigation in conflict resolution between business partners. The establishment of bilateral or multilateral trade agreements, such as NAFTA or Mercosur, is another good example of such creativity. Partners then select the best alternative, one that is culturally acceptable to all partners and meets the goals and objectives of their respective organizations. Finally, the partners implement the culturally synergistic solution. An example might again be useful. U.S. sales representatives of an American-based air freight company with extensive Asian operations generally promised customers specific dates and hours for flight arrivals of freight shipments. However, shipments often arrived late. American customers would usually understand and forgive these delays if given an adequate explanation, whereas Japanese customers expected the company to keep its promise and lost faith in the company when they did not adhere to the promised arrival times. Unlike Americans, the Japanese sales representatives often refused to promise delivery time until, as the Americans explained, the plane had landed on the runway, or as the Japanese explained, they could be certain that their promise would be kept. In interpreting this situation, we can say that the company needed to design a uniform promising system that would be culturally appropriate for both the American and Japanese employees and clients. From the American perspective, the system had to be definite enough to create credibility among American customers. From the Japanese perspective, the promises to customers had to conform to reality sufficiently so that no one would lose face. After analyzing the underlying cultural dynamics of both systems, the sales representatives agreed that they could begin promising delivery within a range of time rather than at specific times. For instance, they would promise clients delivery early afternoon on Thursday rather than at 2:03 p.m., the scheduled time of the flight arrival. Thus, Americans could continue to promise, and Japanese would rarely promise anything that they could not deliver. This solution recognizes the values of both cultures without upsetting either culture's management practices. As a synergistic solution, it is new and acceptable to both cultures. Coming back to our starting point, the potential for conflict generated by the restructuring, relocation, and re-engineering organizations and markets experience as a result of globalization. We see ample opportunity for the need to identify and utilize creative conflict resolution strategies and techniques. These hyperdynamic times in which we compete challenge us to abandon traditional approaches to conducting business and traditional approaches to resolving conflict. The remaining panelists in this session and throughout this series will discuss the specifics of a variety of culturally synergistic creative conflict resolution strategies.
Let us begin now with the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question